That's the story people think they know. A dinner, a chair, a public reprimand. The Queen rising from her place to stop Camilla Parker Bowles from sitting somewhere she wasn't meant to sit. It makes for a dramatic headline. But it isn't what happened. What actually happened was quieter, colder, and in some ways far more devastating than any single dinner table scene could ever be. It was a document, a hierarchy, a rule written down in 2005 that decided, with almost mathematical precision, exactly how far Camilla was allowed to rise, and exactly where she still had to stand behind two other women, even after she'd married the future king. This is that real story. Long before there was any question of seating charts, there was a gold bracelet, 2 letters engraved on it, G and F, Gladys and Fred, the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. Long before the public knew a third person existed in that marriage, Diana discovered it 14 days before her wedding, according to the account she gave Andrew Morton. She told her sisters she didn't want to go through with it. Their answer was blunt. It was too late. Her face was already on commemorative mugs. There was no stopping the machine. So she walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in front of 750 million people, carrying a truth the world didn't know yet. By 1989, Diana had stopped pretending. At a birthday party in Richmond for Camilla's sister, she went looking for her husband and found him missing. She turned to her bodyguard, Ken Wharf, and said simply, "You have to come with me. I can't find my husband or Camilla." They searched the house together until they found Charles and Camilla in the basement, talking with another guest. Diana asked everyone to leave. What happened next, by her own account to Morton, was this. She told Camilla she knew exactly what was going on, and to stop treating her like a fool. Camilla reportedly reminded her of everything she supposedly had, the public's love, 2 sons, and asked what more she could possibly want. Diana's answer, "I want my husband." She later called that confrontation one of the bravest things she ever did as a wife. Not a press statement, not a television interview, a basement, no cameras, just the truth said out loud to the one person who needed to hear it. Diana died in Paris on August 31, 1997. Many assumed the road was now clear for Camilla. It wasn't, because one woman still controlled every title, every guest list, every rule of precedence in the family, and she was nowhere near ready to let go of any of them. According to Tom Bower's Rebel Prince, at Balmoral in 1998, Charles asked his mother to finally soften her position. Her answer, as Bower recorded it, as head of the Church of England, she could not condone adultery, nor forgive Camilla for staying close to Charles while he was still married. Then came the line that followed her for years. "That wicked woman? I want nothing to do with her." That November, at Charles's 50th birthday, the Queen hosted a reception for him the night before at Buckingham Palace, but skipped the actual party the next night at Highgrove, where Camilla was hostess. So did Philip, so did his siblings, except Margaret. The message needed no memo. Charles couldn't fight the Queen's silence with confrontation, so his team fought it with photography. Mark Bolland, his deputy private secretary, engineered what internally became known as Operation Ritz, a January 1999 exit from a hotel, timed for 200 waiting photographers, 15 seconds of Charles and Camilla walking out together with no statement, no interviews, just the image. It worked. Coverage shifted. Public tolerance grew, slowly, across years, one carefully managed appearance at a time. In June 2000, at a birthday party for the exiled King Constantine of Greece at Highgrove, the Queen and Camilla shared a room and a table for the first time since Diana's death. No warm reconciliation. A curtsy. A few formal words. That was the entire scene, and it was treated as a historic thaw simply because it was the first time it had happened at all. By 2005, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony the Queen pointedly did not attend, a decision explained as her discomfort, as head of the Church of England attending a civil wedding of 2 divorced people. But she did attend the blessing afterward at St. George's Chapel and personally hosted the reception, where she joked about the couple having cleared racing fences like Besher's Brook and the Chair, the room reportedly erupting in laughter. 2 messages delivered on the same day, distance and acceptance at once. Here is the actual seat this story is named for, and it isn't a chair at all. In 2005, the palace issued an internal document, Precedents of the Royal Family to be observed at court. It didn't strip Camilla of any title, but it established that in private gatherings, whenever Camilla appeared without Charles at her side, she ranked behind the Queen, behind Princess Anne, and behind Princess Alexandra, 4th among senior royal women. even as the wife of the future king. The moment Charles stood beside her, she rose to his rank automatically. The moment she stood alone, she didn't. There was no dramatic scene of the Queen rising from a table to stop her from sitting somewhere. There didn't need to be. The instruction was written down, quietly, and the family simply obeyed it, the same way the Queen had handled almost everything involving Camilla for 8 straight years. Not with a scene, but with a rule nobody was allowed to question. That was the real seat Camilla was given. Not first. Not equal. Fourth in line in a private room, unless the one man who could lift her rank happened to be standing right beside her. There's a version of this story that stops at palace documents and precedence charts, as if the only casualties were institutional. That's not true. And Prince Harry made sure of that in his memoir, Spare. Harry recalled his first formal meeting with Camilla at Highgrove and compared it to getting an injection. Close your eyes, endure it, hope it's over quickly. He was a teenager being handed a script written by adults who had already decided the outcome months in advance. He later wrote that he felt deeply conflicted about gaining a stepmother under those circumstances, and that he came to believe he'd been, in his words, sacrificed on the altar of his father's public relations. That's Harry's own interpretation, not an independently verified account of anyone's intentions. But it tells you something the precedence documents never could, what it actually felt like to be a child inside a public relations campaign you never agreed to be part of. Tom Bower wrote that Camilla's presence served as a constant reminder to both princes of what their mother had endured, and that there were moments when both brothers tried to avoid uncomfortable encounters inside the royal residences. Again, a biographer's account, not confirmed testimony from William, who has never given his own public version of these years. But Harry did, in a 60 Minutes interview with Anderson Cooper, where he said his father had needed to rehabilitate his image and had built strategic relationships with the British press to do it, and that in a family run on strict hierarchy, that kind of process, in his words, could leave bodies behind. He said he believed he'd been one of them. Whatever the precise truth of those feelings, they sat directly underneath every historic Thor headline the newspapers printed. The Queen easing her position wasn't just a diplomatic shift. For 2 boys who'd grown up watching their mother named as the 3rd person in her own marriage on national television, it was something closer to watching the institution slowly make peace with the person their mother believed had displaced her. By February 2002, the frieze had thinned enough that Camilla was included in a celebration connected to the Queen's Golden Jubilee at Buckingham Palace. Royal journalist Katie Nicholl described this invitation as marking the effective end of the most visible hostilities, not because anyone announced it as such, but because inclusion in an event tied directly to the Queen's own reign meant something different than a shared table at somebody else's birthday party. It's worth sitting with how slowly this all moved. Diana died in August 1997. The first shared room came in June 2000, nearly 3 years later. The Golden Jubilee inclusion came in 2002, 5 years after Paris. Nothing about this thaw was sudden. Every step was calculated, spaced out, tested against public reaction before the next one was allowed to happen. That pace was not an accident. It was, by every account, exactly how the Queen preferred to manage difficult family matters, not through declarations, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate signals over years. There was still one obstacle standing behind the Queen the entire time: her own mother. The Queen Mother's opposition to Camilla was, if anything, described as even more absolute than her daughter's. Robert Jobson wrote that Camilla's name simply wasn't welcome in the Queen Mother's presence. Biographer Tom Quinn went further, arguing that Charles would have found it nearly impossible to marry Camilla while his grandmother was still alive, regardless of whatever ground the Queen herself was willing to give. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, at 101 years old. No document confirms that her death was the deciding factor in what came next, and it would be dishonest to present it as a proven cause and effect. But several biographers, including Christopher Anderson, have pointed to the timing as more than coincidence, because after April 9th of that year, when Camilla attended the funeral and reportedly held a private conversation with Charles and the Queen about integrating her further into royal life, the pace of change noticeably picked up. 2 generations of resistance had stood in the way. Now only one remained, and she had 3 years later, in 2005, Charles and Camilla announced their engagement. When they married that April at Windsor Guildhall, it was a small civil ceremony, 28 guests, William and Tom Parker Bowles as witnesses. Both bride and groom came to it as divorcees. Neither the Queen nor Prince Philip attended the civil portion. The official explanation offered at the time was that the couple wanted it private and low-key, but because the Queen also serves as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, her absence drew intense scrutiny regardless. What she did attend was the service of prayer and dedication afterward at St. George's Chapel, standing beside Philip throughout, and she personally hosted the reception at Windsor Castle that followed. 2 signals, delivered on the same day, to 2 different audiences, distance from the civil act itself, and clear public warmth toward the marriage as a whole. Then there was the matter of the title. By law, upon marrying the Prince of Wales, Camilla was entitled to be styled Princess of Wales. She didn't take it. The title had become so inseparably linked to Diana in the public imagination that using it risked triggering exactly the kind of comparison the family had spent 8 years trying to avoid. Instead, Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, a quieter title, chosen specifically to sidestep a direct measuring of one woman against the other. It's a small decision, easy to skip past in the timeline. But it says something important. Even at the moment of her greatest institutional victory, Camilla was still operating inside the shadow of the woman she'd once confronted in a basement. She'd learned, over 16 years, exactly how much room she was and wasn't allowed to take up, and on her own wedding day she was still reading the room the same way. The reception itself produced one of the most quoted moments of the entire saga. The Grand National had run earlier that same afternoon, and the Queen, a lifelong horse racing devotee, stood to give a toast in which she compared Charles and Camilla's long road to marriage to clearing the National's most notorious jumps, naming Besh's Brook and the chair specifically, before wishing them both happiness. The room reportedly erupted in laughter. Author Gilly Cooper, who was present, later described the entire room being brought to laughter by the line. Tom Bower's reading of the moment is that even though the Queen avoided ever addressing Camilla by name directly in the speech, the underlying message was unmistakably supportive. It's a genuinely warm scene, the kind that made headlines describe the Cold War as finally over, and in the most visible public sense it was. But warmth at a reception and warmth in the machinery of royal protocol are 2 different things. And it's the second one that actually explains where this story's title comes from. Marrying Charles didn't just change Camilla's public status, it forced the palace to answer a set of very unglamorous, very consequential questions. Who bows to whom? Who enters a room first? Who takes precedence in a receiving line when husbands aren't present? These aren't ceremonial trivia in the British royal system. They're formal rules written down that determine exactly how the institution treats each of its members relative to each other for the rest of their lives. The answer came in a 2005 internal document titled Precedents of the Royal Family to be Observed at Court, prepared under the Queen's direct authority. It didn't touch Camilla's marriage or any title she legally held. What it did was quietly, permanently define her position whenever she appeared without Charles standing next to her. Under traditional British precedents, a wife shares her husband's rank when she's beside him, so at any official event with Charles present, Camilla would take a position immediately behind the Queen, ahead of most other royal women. That much was uncontested. Private gatherings were where the document actually mattered. There, the principle applied was royal blood, and under that principle, whenever Camilla appeared without Charles, she ranked behind the Queen, behind Princess Anne, and behind Princess Alexandra, 4th among the senior women of the family. The wife of the future King of England, placed behind 2 princesses simply because they'd been born into the bloodline and she hadn't. This is the actual mechanism behind every version of this story that gets told as a dramatic dinner table scene. There was no chair pulled out from under her in front of a room of gasping guests. There didn't need to be. The Queen didn't deliver the message in a scene. She delivered it in a memo, and the family and court staff simply followed it. The same quiet, procedural way the Queen had handled nearly everything to do with Camilla for the better part of a decade. No official statement ever confirmed that this precedence rule existed specifically to protect Diana's memory or to punish Camilla. Treating that as settled fact would go further than the evidence supports. It may have reflected the accumulated tension of those years. It may simply have reflected the traditional weight British protocol places on royal blood over marriage. It was likely some combination of both, filtered through a woman who had spent her entire life managing exactly these kinds of quiet, precise distinctions. What's certain is the outcome, and the outcome is the whole story in miniature. Camilla became, by law, the wife of the heir to the throne. She did not, by custom, automatically outrank the women who'd been born into the family, unless her husband happened to be standing beside her. Full acceptance, with an asterisk built into the paperwork. A seat at the table, conditional on whether the man who'd fought for 16 years to get her there was sitting in the chair next to it. It's worth stepping back at the end of this and asking what actually changed across the 25 years between the bracelet and the coronation. Diana confronted Camilla in a basement in 1989 and called it one of the bravest things she'd ever done, not because it won her the marriage back, but because for the first time, she'd said the truth out loud to the person at the center of it, and no one could tell her afterward that she'd imagined it. 8 years later, she was dead, and the woman she'd confronted spent the following decade absorbing a slow, deliberate, institutional cold shoulder from the only person in Britain with the authority to end it. The Queen never explained herself in public. She didn't need to. She communicated the way she always had, through what she attended and what she skipped, who she sat beside and who she kept behind 2 other women in a private hierarchy nobody outside the family was ever meant to see. That wicked woman in 1998 gradually became a shared table in 2000, an inclusion in the Golden Jubilee in 2002, a wedding blessing and a joke about the Grand National in 2005, and running underneath all of it the entire time, a written rule that never let Camilla forget exactly how conditional all of it still was. By the time Camilla became Queen Consort in 2022, and was crowned in 2023, the distance the Queen had once insisted on was long gone in every visible way. But the story underneath the title was never really about a chair, or even about a document. It was about what it cost. Diana, who never lived to see any of it resolve. Charles, who spent decades trying to close a gap his mother controlled entirely. William and Harry, who grew up watching the woman tied to their mother's pain slowly, formally absorbed into their own family circle, without ever being asked if they were ready for it. And Camilla herself, who reached the highest position available to her and still, on paper, had to wait for her husband to walk into the room before she was allowed to stand where she'd been placed. That's the real ending, not a scene at a dinner table, a quiet document, obeyed without comment, that said everything the Queen had never once said out loud. By May 2023, the woman once described as that wicked woman stood in Westminster Abbey and was crowned Queen Consort beside her husband, King Charles III. The precedence document from 2005 had, by then, mostly stopped mattering in the way it once did, because the woman who'd written it was gone, and the family it governed had reorganized itself entirely around a new king. But it's worth asking what that document actually settled, and what it never could. It settled rank. It settled who bowed to whom, who walked first through a doorway, who stood where in a receiving line. Those are real questions in the British monarchy, and the 2005 memo answered them with total clarity, 4th among senior women, unless Charles stood beside her. What it never settled, and what no document ever could, was the emotional inheritance underneath all of it. Harry's account in Spare makes clear that even years later, he and William carried complicated feelings about Camilla's slow absorption into their family, feelings a precedence chart has no mechanism to address, because they were never really about protocol. They were about a mother who wasn't there to see any of it. The Queen's own resistance, in the end, tells a similar story from the opposite direction. She never explained that wicked woman in public. She never apologized for the years of silence, the skipped birthday parties, the deliberate absences. She simply, slowly, let the distance close, through a shared table in 2000, a Jubilee invitation in 2002, a wedding blessing in 2005, and finally, in her own handwriting, a wish in 2022 that Camilla be known one day as Queen Consort. That wish outlived her by months. So when people ask what really happened at that royal dinner, whether Camilla sat somewhere she shouldn't have, whether the Queen rose to stop her in front of everyone, the honest answer is that no single dinner like that is documented anywhere. What's documented instead is slower, and in its way harder to watch. A family that settled its deepest wounds not through confrontation, but through paperwork, and a woman who spent nearly a decade proving her patience to an institution that never once said out loud that it had accepted her. The chair was never the point. The waiting was.